My name is Michael Guyot, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour here is Chris Irons, who's got a phenomenal podcast himself and really has a really, I think, unique way of talking about markets and the current environment here. But Chris, for those who are not familiar with your background, just introduce yourself. Who are you? How'd you get involved in markets, and what are you doing with the podcast?
Yeah, sure. So, my name's Chris Irons. I'm from Philadelphia. I got involved with markets when I was probably like 18 years old, just on my own. I didn't go to school for finance or anything like that. I spent, a good decade learning the markets by losing a lot of money and getting everything wrong. Taught myself, how to trade equities, how to trade options, how to trade, pretty much anything. An expensive lesson, but one that I'm glad that I learned on my own and not from somebody else. Glad I kind of did it the hard way. From there, I started writing under, my name, Quote the Raven. I went to work for one of my first gigs out of college, or actually out of graduate school, was working for a small startup company, public company that ultimately, didn't do very well, but I worked as their head of investor relations, which got me like my first taste into the world of public filings and, sitting around with securities lawyers and C-suite executives and poring over excruciatingly minute details in filings and things like that. I did that for a couple of years. Then I went to work for a company called Geo Investing, who I found because they were producing a lot of research on U.S. listed China-based companies, along with Carson and Muddy Waters when they first started doing it. Right around the same time, in like around 2010, 2011. So I read a report by Geo Investing on Longway Petroleum, and I was like, wow, this is like real research compared to a lot of the sell side crap that I had been reading, and a lot of like the automated garbage that gets spit out online. At the same time, I was writing on my own under Quote the Raven on Seeking Alpha, just kind of learning, and they had kind of heard of me from writing on Seeking Alpha, and I knew of them from their reports. So went to go work for them for like 5 years. They specialized in identifying microcap longs, actually like nanocap and microcap longs. There were, two partners to that business, Maj Soidan and Dan David. Maj specialized in microcaps, something that he's extremely talented in. And Dan worked a lot on the short side, working to expose a lot of U.S. listed China-based frauds. So I spent like 5.5 years there working for them. And that kind of helped me take my understanding of public filings and details and nuance and all those things to a different level. And then, I became active doing research on the short side, which is something that I still do. I also do, my podcast, and I have my Substack that I write on. And that's pretty much the long and short of it. There's not really, I guess throughout the process, there's a video on my YouTube channel where I gave a speech in Vegas a couple of years ago that lays out this whole story a little bit longer. But, throughout the process, I started to kind of identify that a lot of the same markers of fraud and nonsense that you would see in public companies also are found when it comes to the macro economy, which made me intensely skeptical of monetary policy and macro in general. All this MMT garbage and new Keynesian stuff. And to me, growing up, economics was very simple. In the house where I was raised, you balance your checkbook, you run at a surplus, you spend less than you earn, all very basic like Econ 101 principles. And what I saw when I started to understand the macroeconomic picture a little bit better was, wow, we do the exact opposite of that. Like, we're completely irresponsible, and we've given it a name, modern monetary theory, or, Keynesian theory, whatever you want to call it that day, to kind of let people know that it's okay that we're doing this, because there's some academic sounding jargon that can explain away the fact that we're being fiscally and monetarily irresponsible. And I took exception with that years ago when I started to figure it out. Every day, the more that I learned, excuse me, every day, the more that I learned, the more horrified I became. And that's, that's continued now for years. There hasn't been a point where I've stopped and been like, wow, I think things are going to get better. Every day it's more like, wow, I can't believe they're letting things get worse. And so here we are with, CPI at 8.5%, starting to reap some of the whirlwind of what we've been sowing here over the last couple of years. And it's one of the things that I spend a lot of time writing about and talking about on my podcast.
All right, so there's a lot of directions to go with that, and that I saw that on YouTube. I think the title of it was "Our Economy is Bullshit" or "It's Built on Bullshit," which I would largely agree with, given just the way that the trajectory of debt has been. But I want to go to the name of your Substack. You call it quote the Ravens Fringe Finance, and I want to focus on the word fringe for a moment because you've got the mainstream narratives around markets where it's mostly, to your point, sell side analysts, portfolio managers that are basically hugging an index because there's career risk otherwise. And then there's everybody else that you see on FinTwit, which is trying to get a little bit deeper, trying to understand the truth and figure out how to differentiate against the passive vehicles. Fringe seems to have a connotation that it's negative, but in reality, it's just a different point of view. So I want you to talk about what having a fringe outlook means in the context of markets, in the context of the economy, and why is it that more people should be focused on different voices and different ways of expressing things the way people follow you.
Listen, I don't take myself very seriously. And so, I named the blog that for a couple of reasons, right? The first is that I really want people to, it's the same reason that if you read my disclaimer on the posts, what it says is, look, I'm an idiot and I get a lot of things wrong often. I probably get more things wrong than I get right. I mean, that's probably a fair statement. And some of the things that I write about and talk about are in this gray area between, what we know as an accepted truth and things that maybe we're still trying to figure out. Right. So, I call it fringe finance, one, because it's funny, it's a little hyperbolic, but also two, because there's a whole host of issues that people don't talk about. And it's not because they're either right or wrong. It's because nowadays it feels like we can't talk about them. You can't raise critical questions. You can't have Socratic dialogue. There's certain buzzwords that now you can't say. I mean, in the world of investing, if you want to figure out whether or not something you're buying or selling is worth buying or selling, the way to do it is to get all the facts out on the table, everything as objectively as possible. Find me the biggest bull that knows the most about the company and tell me what the best bull case is, and find me the biggest bear and tell me what the best bear case is, and lay those things out like, fucking tarot cards on the table in front of me, and let me sift through them. And, that's what analysis is, right? Analysis is trying to take all of the objective facts that you can ascertain, and then from there, try to determine what your best course of action is to generate alpha, right? This company's either undervalued or it's overvalued. I'll short it or I'll go long, or it's just not worth my time and I can't figure it out, so I'll do nothing. And so, I'm a firm believer that when it comes to everything, not just investments, but, politics, ideologies, whatever it is, that the only way we're going to arrive at some type of best practices as a human race, as a civilization, as a society, as a country, as, a group of investors, whatever, is to be able to get everything out on the table and then sift through it from there, right? And so the climate here over the last couple of years has been making it difficult to do that, because you have big tech, you have social media, you have politicians, you have all these people kind of ganging up together to try to squelch the parts of that objective dialogue that they don't like. So in other words, if you say something like learn to code, you know, you're just immediately banned and shut down and kicked off the social media platform. You know, if you ask a critical question about, you know, where the COVID virus came from or whether or not, you know, whatever the vaccines work as they've been purported to work, or you ask about, you know, modern monetary theory, or you ask about, you know, why we're focused on jobs and spending instead of savings and underconsumption, you know, you're kind of automatically labeled as a conspiracy theorist just for bringing this stuff up. When the reality of the situation is you have to talk about these things. All of these things have to be discussed, even if it's only to rule them out, right? Even if it is wrong to say that the virus came out of a lab, it still has to be discussed. I mean, you can't say that it's wrong without objectively looking at it and analyzing it and, you know, going through the scientific method and trying to figure out whether those claims hold any water. And so, you know, the fringe is kind of this area here where, like, you're not really allowed to even tread anymore. And so that's kind of where I focus a lot of my time on. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't be doing that if I didn't honestly think that therein lied some of the answers to some things. You know, like, certainly I'm not getting everything right. Okay. Perfect example is ivermectin. I wrote an article about ivermectin, you know, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, asking whether or not, oh, you know, it's kind of started to feel like the mainstream media was starting to pivot on ivermectin a little bit. And of course, there was all this, you know, clinical data out there that was being pushed around. And there was a great meta analysis that was put out over whether or not it was effective. And then that was challenged because one of the underlying analyses was fraudulent and all this other shit. So I wrote this article about whether or not, you know, the tide was going to turn and eventually there would be a pivot on it. And there wasn't. You know, in fact, there were one or two other studies that have been released subsequent to that really haven't shown anything in favor of ivermectin. And so without discussing the details of that, the point is that, hey, you know, I wrote this article and it looks as though, you know, it may not have been on base, right? Now, in February, I also wrote an article called Modern Monetary Theory is Destroying the United States, which I truly believe. I mean, these are opinion pieces, right? And so, and in November, you know, in December, before inflation got to where it is now, you know, I was writing articles talking about how these small ticks in what was then being called transitory inflation could turn into a much bigger disaster than we thought. And what happened over the next 6 months is inflation went through the roof, and the politicians and the central bankers were forced to recant this idiocy about inflation being transitory. And now here we are watching 9% of our purchasing power on our saved money disappear year over year. And so in that case, you know, that was kind of the right question to ask. Right. And I really do believe, and we can talk about it, that modern monetary theory is just we have ridden this train to the end of the line here. There's nowhere left for us to go. But the reason the blog is called Fringe Finance is because, you know, there are some real objective truths and some real objective answers that exist in this gray area. And, you know, what we've seen, not just with finance, but, you know, in the world of politics too. I mean, if you look at what happened with, you know, when this Hunter Biden's laptop thing happened, there were like 50 intelligence officials that came out and swore to Politico, I think, who published it, that this thing was fake and it was Russian disinformation, you know. And now here we are a year later, and it turns out actually that's not the case. It was real, you know. And so then when we were, you know, asking about whether or not it was real, and the official narrative was that it was disinformation, oh, you were seen as peddling disinformation. In January 2020, when when the headlines first started breaking coming out of Wuhan, that, hey, you know, we got a dozen cases here, we got 15 cases there. And, you know, I started to write about it. And it wasn't just me, it was Chris Martenson, it was George Gammon, it was a lot of these other people that, hey, you know, if it's going on in Wuhan and we just had the holiday season, and it's contagious, it's going to be here. It's already here in the United States, to start preparing. Well, I was labeled a fearmonger. I was labeled, somebody that was trying to incite panic. And I wasn't just sitting at home typing "go buy masks" and, doing nothing. I mean, I was stocking my basement with liquor, among other things. But, I was telling people, hey, I'm going out and I'm buying ammunition and I'm buying whiskey and I'm buying masks. And, I was tweeting out pandemic preparedness lists saying, hey, you don't have to do this, but in the event that you want to be safe and you want to get ahead of the crowd, and this is something, it's better safe than sorry. And so 3 months later, while everybody else was fighting over toilet paper, it became pretty evident that it was an issue. And so again, that was one of those things that at the time, it was on the fringe to talk about, right? It was, nobody was really, certainly wasn't the mainstream narrative. But if you're waiting
Right,
for the,
and I think the issue with the way the mainstream frames the word fringe in general is that you mentioned it earlier. That there's a view that it's conspiratorial, whereas it's really just asking questions and trying to apply a degree of critical thought around what somebody else is saying, right? And you see that a lot, unfortunately, I think, when it comes to the investment crowd and the Federal Reserve and the policymakers, because they have a narrative, but then all you have to do is ask a few questions a little bit deeper, and you're labeled as fringe, you're labeled as somebody that shouldn't be listened to. But then oftentimes these investment fringe arguments and theories end up being proven right, just they were early.
yeah, and that's okay. I don't mind. I label myself fringe. I put in my disclaimer that I get things wrong. I'm okay. Like, I don't need to be, Mr. Suit and Tie on CNBC. I don't really care. I don't care like how seriously people choose to take me or not take me. I mean, I honestly don't give a shit. I didn't wake up one day 10 years ago and say, "Oh, I want to be Mr., fucking finance contributor." Like, I could care less. I have other things in my life that, I enjoy doing. I like jujitsu. I like drinking beer and watching football. I like hanging out with my friends, so it's not my goal to become some uh, you know, I don't know, some finance commentator that's appreciated for his insights or whatever. I write because it's cathartic for me. It's easy for me. It seems to me a lot of these things seem to be common sense. Oftentimes, when I write pieces, they generate a lot of good feedback. So people email me or they write in the comments and bring up things that I didn't know, which is something, and that happens on Twitter too. That's something that I really appreciate, because it kind of begets additional information. Um, and I embrace the idea. If you want to call me whatever you want to call me, and I know there's a large group of people out there that really don't take anything that I have to say seriously, and that's fine with that. Like, I'm okay with that. That's not a big deal. So I just kind of embrace that. I'm happy to call myself fringe. I'm happy to tell you that I'm an idiot. I'm happy to tell you that, I've lost money trading. I'm happy to tell you that, I don't feel like I have anything to prove. I'm just trying to make sense of some stuff, and that's it. And then on Sundays I'm trying to watch the Eagles and, eat tacos and drink beer. Pretty simple guy.
What's interesting is that in the context of asset allocation, the synonym for fringe would be satellite, right? When you think about sort of a core satellite type of portfolio, the satellite strategies that are on the periphery are the fringe strategy this year. But I think if you're going to be an entrepreneur or try to invest differently, you have to have a fringe mindset, because otherwise you are core. You're just cheap
Well,
data.
exactly. And, a lot of what I'm talking about, which is trying to get all this objective information and then kind of sort through the muck to get to the truth, is it's very similar to like special situation investing, right? When somebody releases a negative report on a company, or, there's a rumor going around that a company might get bought out, or there's a couple of language changes in a 10K somewhere buried in the risk factors that nobody noticed or whatever. I mean, what's the point? The point is you want to get as much objective information as possible, and you want to process it faster than anybody else. It's difficult to do nowadays because a lot of things are algo driven, but there are still you know, plenty of pockets of information arbitrage like that, where your success as an investor is going to be based on how quickly you can digest, the objective facts, and then process what you believe them to mean. Because, when a special situation occurs, whether it's a stock spike on a buyout rumor or a stock, plunge on a negative report from a company or whatever, they're just dislocations. And then it's up to you to figure out whether those dislocations are opportunistic or whether or not they are, correct in the way that they're moving, and then figure things out accordingly. So it's very much like special situations investing, where the clock is ticking, and your job is to kind of root through as much objective data as possible to arrive at a conclusion. And look, when it comes to something like modern monetary theory, okay, and it comes to something like inflation, it comes to something like the central banks. I mean, I can't. I don't do a lot of podcasts other than my own. I don't do a lot of these spaces and stuff. I I don't I don't feel like sitting back and trying to convince the world every day that these policies are misguided and that they're leading us in the wrong direction, and that we're going to reap what we're sowing. I mean, you could say it every day, and like, I don't have the stamina of like Peter Schiff, right? Who can just go and go and go, and he's on the news and he's doing a podcast and he's doing this and he's doing that, and like, I got to tell you, not trying to sound like an asshole, but like, people invite me to come on their podcast and stuff all the time, and I'm just like, what do I have to add other than what I wrote this week or what I said on my podcast this week, which is nothing. Like, if it it's so, you can't make it make sense for people that $30 trillion in debt, and like I just wrote this morning, Elizabeth Warren is out there talking about Joe Biden canceling student debt. I know a lot of that's government debt, but I mean, that debt gets monetized, and the taxpayers wind up paying for it one way or another through inflation. Or, we're out there talking about things like that at a point where the country's in an inflationary crisis, and we're signing bills into law that, where we're going out and spending an additional $450 billion that we don't have. I mean, to be in the position we're in and not be doing anything other than decreasing spending, government spending right now, is asinine. And I can't make people come to that conclusion. I can't, I can't make Joe Biden arrive at the conclusion that price fixing oil is not going to work. We have overshot the mark of basic economic laws so badly, and we have compiled this horrible, I always liken it to like putting an addition on your house, right? You have this nice little house, which is like Econ 101. And then you put this little addition on it, which is like, all right, well, now we're going to come off the gold standard. And then you put another little addition on it. It's like, all right, we're going to do a little light quantitative easing. And by the way, we're looking at spending. We're not looking at productivity anymore. And, all the way up until the very, very, very last definition that had some semblance of Austrian economics, which was GDP, right, which is a measure of productivity. This is like the last relic of like basic economic law that now we're trying to change, saying, well, we're not necessarily in recession until if productivity is slowing down. It's like, yeah, actually, that's what a fucking recession is. Like, it's a contraction in economic productivity. So, we have just we are just defiling the corpse of what's left of basic economic law here. And, no matter how many Twitter spaces you or I do, people just aren't going to figure it out. It just doesn't seem like, and the answer is right there.
And that goes directly to the name of the space, which I changed a few times, but economic stupidity and the crisis of logic. And the question I always wrestle with is why. So I've made this joke many times before that the most prophetic movie of all time was Idiocracy, right? Which I think is what we're seeing. But why is that? I don't believe that people have not necessarily gotten dumber on average. I mean, I'm sure average IQs are still the same compared to history. I mean, what is driving this complete lack of wanting to actually push back on these narratives, on these policies, even the canceling of student debt? And I agree 100%. To me, that's sort of paving the way for broader debt forgiveness, which is probably the real end game.
I think it's just it's a nasty mix of like not understanding how the whole thing works, lack of education and like willful ignorance. A lot of people don't understand the basics, and they either don't understand them because they don't have the capacity to understand it and they're not interested in economics or whatever, or because they're like good everyday Americans who are like plumbers, welders, and like the guys that I hang out with that don't really give a fuck because they're too busy out there generating the productivity that the country definitely, needs. When I'm talking to my buddy who's laying bricks here in Old City, Philadelphia to help repair the roads, which are all cobblestone roads, and I try to have a conversation with him about, Austrian versus Keynesian economics. Like, he doesn't care, he spends the day putting bricks into the ground so that the cobblestone roads here look nice. And then when he gets done, he knows that he's worked. He knows that he's generated productivity for 8 hours. He knows that he's, contributing to something, and he wants to have a beer and he wants to kick it and he wants to relax. He doesn't want to dive into the fucking intricacies of inflation. And so, there's a lot of great people in this country that are similarly situated. They do what they were born and raised and told to do, which is to be productive and to support their household economically, and they do that through working, and they trust that the system is sound and that the system is working the way it should be, and that they trust that if they go out and work for 40 years that they're going to be okay. And that's what makes inflation and a lot of these other MMT / Keynesian concepts so nefarious, is they operate in the background, right? They're like this background program on your computer that's running that nobody really sees or hears, or especially when inflation was at 2%, 3%. The Fed and the government saying everything's fine, but really they're whittling away at your savings to the tune of 2% or 3% every year.
And I would argue your rights, which goes actually to your post about it's quietly stripping away our private property rights. So I want you to also riff on that, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, you're right. And the point is that, all of these things are happening in the background. And so, this is occurring because there's this nasty mixture of people not understanding what's going on, people that are, working and don't have the time, they don't care to understand it. And then I think there's also on the far, far other end of the spectrum, there's a group of, academics and wannabe faux academics out there that really think that there's an arrogance there where they think that they have figured out a way that they can micromanage and kind of rewrite economic laws and, natural laws to their liking. And they're going to find out what everybody else throughout history has found out, which is that, natural laws and economic laws have a way of whipsawing back and reverting to the mean. And they will. And that's, what cost the Roman Empire. And, there will be consequences for that. So, Ron Paul says, look, the free market is always going to win. It may take a little bit more time. We can distort things as much as we'd like, but at some point there's going to be a reversion. And then if they try to distort things even further to the point where, you talk about global debt jubilees or the Great Reset or any of this bullshit, then the consequences are going to be different. It might be like civil unrest consequences in that case. I don't know. All I know is there's a certain arrogance from people that go out and claim that, we have this under control and that we can micromanage, which, what are pretty much sacrosanct, very natural laws that, the laws of economics are the laws for a reason. And so as far as we want to try to deviate from them, they're eventually going to whipsaw back to the mean. And whatever they in that process, whatever consequences there are that we're going to have to bear the brunt of, we will. But for now, it's a lot of academics sitting around kind of patting each other on the back, congratulating each other on various awards that they're winning, telling each other that they're, it's like, it reminds me of a debate I watched on MSNBC like 7 years ago or 8 years ago. Or Peter Schiff was debating, he was debating inflation with a couple other people sitting around the desk. And one of them was a Princeton professor, I think. And, he's talking about inflation as a result of expansion of the money supply. And this professor chimes in to make this point about velocity. And basically her point is, look, because there's no velocity with this money, because it's all being parked somewhere, that we're not going to, it's not really inflation. And the way she delivers it is she says to him, listen, there's this thing we learn about in the first year of economics at Princeton. It's a little thing called velocity, like as if he doesn't understand what velocity is, number one. But just delivered that way, that's the arrogance and the hubris. And that's the type of thinking. She's sitting there thinking like, wow, I'm so enlightened. I understand velocity. I'm going to make this incredible point here. When a lot of us are way past that, okay, we get it. Like we get what you are putting forth as the MMT scam. It's like when people tell me about Bitcoin, like, oh, dude, you just don't get it. I'm like, no, maybe the fucking problem is I do get it. Maybe you don't get it.
Let me pause you on that, because I think I think what you're hitting on is something which is such a frustration for me, and has been for so many years, that I went so extreme to point out the ridiculousness of it, to the point where I have the word "few" in my profile, because all these things I keep saying, if you understand this, it's atrocious. This is me basically poking fun at the condescending, elitist nature of any counter argument to anything that I say or anybody else says, that's simply trying to dig deeper. That might be the fringe of the fringe to counter these narratives.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what it boils down to, right? Is it boils down to this, both sides of the aisle both thinking that the other side doesn't get it. And so, when people laugh at advocates for Austrian economics, they often say, dumb things like, oh, broken clock is right twice a day, or, you just don't understand this thing we learned the first year at Princeton economics, which is called velocity. Have you ever heard of it? It's like, yeah. Like, maybe the problem is they do get it, and they do understand the argument that you're trying to make, and they still think that it's flawed. So it's like, look, no matter how much academic jargon you cloak this disgusting pig of an economy and this horrifying monetary policy in, the consequences, it's like plugging a hole in a dam. Like you plug one hole and all of a sudden the leak moves somewhere else. And then, you plug another hole and all of a sudden the leak moves somewhere else. It's like, the problem is there's just too much water pressure. Like you're not going to be able to stop the dam from bursting, no matter how many times you go and try to put a Band-Aid on things. And the longer we do that, the worse the consequences are going to be. And so a lot of arrogance.
Please make sure you follow Chris on Twitter, and obviously subscribe to his podcast, Quote the Raven. It's funny, by the way, Chris, that I noticed on Apple it's categorized as investing. On Spotify it's categorized as comedy, and I give you a lot of credit because I think it's a combination of the two. If you want to ask questions,
well, and look, I don't set out to be a comedian. It's just that the system is so ridiculous that
I agree 100%. Yeah, it's
kind of funny.
Right, no, and that's the other thing. I've tweeted that out before. It's like, what else am I supposed to do when Rome is burning except make fun of it?
It's also it's also like a travesty of like Shakespearean proportions, right? So you can categorize it however you want. I don't know. Substack does the same thing. They one day I'm in politics, the other day I'm in finance, the next day I'm in business, whatever. It's like I don't care. People ask me what my podcast is. I say just don't listen. Don't worry about it.
Right. Comedy of errors, I think, is the best way to describe it.
I think what haunts me in general is the fact that, and this is why I like doing short research too, because a lot of times when you're doing research on companies that are either committing fraud or, not playing nice, they're misrepresenting, their business or whatever. What it is oftentimes a lot of people that think that they're smarter than everybody else and that they're kind of getting one over on everybody else. And I don't really like that. I think that being a public company is an exorbitant privilege. It allows you access to trillions of dollars in liquidity. It keeps all these other absolutely horrific companies that can't generate cash and don't have a real business afloat. It allows them to sell stock. It allows them to enrich their insiders. And so I kind of take offense to that. I feel like those things, those are inefficiencies that should be rooted out. And I think that the wool gets pulled over people's eyes a lot. And so, it's the same exact way that I feel about macro right now. I've been saying the same thing that I've been saying since, I started to figure out what the hell was going on. So my tune hasn't really changed. I'm not surprised by inflation. I've took exception with inflation when it was at 3%. To me, it just seemed very much like the Fed doesn't understand what they're doing. They're too late to react. When they do react, they overshoot the mark. That makes things worse. The gate swings wildly in the other direction. Yet they're held out to have this, understanding of things that the rest of the common folk can't understand. And I don't believe that's the case. I think it's just one of those things where everybody walks around and assumes that somebody else has it under control. But I think I've seen so many times, just growing up, I'm only 40 years old, but just growing up, I've seen so many instances where I've assumed that somebody else has things under control because they're in a position of power, because they have credentials, or because they have a long CV or whatever. And they don't. You show up and you meet them, or you talk to them, or you ask them for proof, or you ask them for their thought process, and there's nothing there. There's it's a big empty head with no ideas in it. And so, the more I've looked into macro and the more I watch the Fed, it seems to be the same type of case. I mean, listen, a lot of people out there, when the FOMC minutes break on a Wednesday, right? It's covered by every international news organization everywhere. It's like some of the biggest news in the world as it unfolds. Why? Because, you got this group of people that sit around and they scrutinize the economy, and then they release their thoughts on it and what they think their policy decisions are going to be accordingly. Now, what the average American thinks is like, wow, they're running complex models and graphs, and they're having these deep discussions to try to figure out, what the best course of action is for everybody going forward. Meanwhile, anybody that's watched this over the last 6 months knows that they are not skating to where the puck is going. They're skating to where the puck has been. But regardless, everybody sits around and kind of assumes that, like, there's this grand meeting of the minds between all these Nobel Prize winning, Nobel candidates, whatever, right? Like the best of the best, the Mensa candidates, the PhDs, the best we can muster up. When really what it boils down to is turn on 60 Minutes and watch Neil Kashkari a year ago say, well, we just print unlimited money. And the guy's like, so you basically just flood the system with money? He's like, yeah, we just flood the system with money. It's like, okay, so all these thoughts about these complex models and charts and graphs and all these incredible brain trusts getting together, trying to, think of these complex solutions and derivatives among derivatives and game theory of what could happen to the global economy. It all just boils down to this fucking guy on the news just saying, like, well, we just hit the go button on the printer, regardless of the consequences. Nobody talks about, inequality, the equality gap, the inequality gap widening. Nobody talks about, what the transfer purchasing power looks like when the Fed does something like QE. It just boils down to that. So it's like, all right, all of a sudden you start to think like, wow, like maybe this isn't a group of people with complex solutions, right? Maybe this is just people that have one solution and they're reacting. They're not skating to where the puck is going. They're skating to where it's been. What they're doing now with rate hikes should have been what they followed through with in 2018, but they didn't because they're at the behest, and they should have done it before that too. Yellen should have done it, but they're at the behest of the stock market. And really, they're cowards. They don't like the pressure of when the market goes down. They don't like the light that it casts them in, and they don't like the political pressure that comes with that. And if you want to be a central banker, the point is to be clinical and objective, right? You're supposed to ease the economy into recessions. If you buy all this Keynesian bullshit, you're supposed to ease the economy into recessions. And then when we're in a boom and we're in a euphoria, you're supposed to kind of, throw a blanket.
Right. That's what's missed.
You're supposed to throw a blanket on that fire. So let me just round out the point I'm trying to make here. The point is, what drives me is I feel like we're surrounded by people that everybody assumes understands what's going on, and that they have this incredible, group of individuals with superpowers, when really they're just average people. Like they go home like we do. There's nothing that Jerome Powell or Neil Kashkari understands that we all don't have the capacity to understand. And so then you start to, hold their decisions in a different light. Like, did they really get it? Why are we staring at 9% inflation right now?
I'd also say real quick before bringing in Alan that there's an incentive mismatch which people don't really fully appreciate, right? So Powell's worth like 30-40 million. You look at Congress, total wealth is like north of 2 billion, right? So the people who are making the policy decisions have an incentive to turn the spigots on because it does benefit them personally. I mean, I know this is a cynical view, but I think there is a reality to that when it comes to looking at the wealth of those who are making decisions.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the kind of like this shit with the Fed governors trading futures ahead of Fed decisions and Congress people buying and selling stocks with information that they have pertaining to fiscal policy decisions that will directly affect their investments. I mean, that's a level of arrogance and hubris that really it makes you feel like, I think Tim Dillon was just saying this on Rogan's podcast. Somebody I was just listening to, that's the kind of arrogance you see like right before the fall of Rome. I mean, that is just preposterous. That is preposterous. The idea, look, putting aside everything I just said, and that these people may not have 1/100th of the understanding that everybody thinks that they do. Put all that aside, right? And then on top of that, to have the arrogance to go and to trade futures ahead of a Fed decision, and you're a Fed governor? Are you fucking kidding me? Are you kidding me? To be Nancy Pelosi, to be fucking around in, tech stock calls and puts. She's not even buying equity. She's going right for the derivatives. She's like, fuck it. I'm going to insider trade. I might as well, make 20 times my money instead of 2 times my money in there, buying and selling Apple calls and puts every week. Give me a break. I mean, that's so horrifically inappropriate, and that goes for both sides of the aisle. Just using Pelosi as an example because she's been in the news. I mean, that is absolutely obscene. And by the way, she's worth $200 million already. A lot of it's due to her husband. He was very successful. Put the shit in a fucking mutual fund and be the Speaker of the House if that's what you want to do. All right. I don't need to see financial disclosures every fucking 2-3 weeks that she's trucking in and out of Tesla calls and Nvidia calls while there's legislation in Congress talking about doling $80 billion out to the EV industry. It's absolutely sickening. And it's just, I mean, tone deaf is an understatement. All right. But it's the same woman that went out and, got her hair done after all the salons were closed in California due to COVID. Same woman that after we found out there was a virus that, was originating in China, decided to go to Chinatown and surround herself with as many Chinese people as possible. I mean, that's, I don't know what to tell you about a person like that. It's just, if you went out of your way to make the worst possible decision, I don't think you could make decisions like that. So it's horrifying. And those are some of the things that kind of keep me motivated to write.
Yes, it's basically the hypocrisy of power, I think is a way to frame it.
It's not and they've never gotten it right. Right. The Fed has never accurately predicted. The Fed has never predicted accurately when and how a recession is going to take place. Now, whether it's
Chris, real quick, but I think this is important, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I think this is important because I think the dilemma with this is that you mentioned the 70s, right? All this is you can argue largely because we got off the gold standard. We'll talk about gold in a moment here, but I think the issue is that economists, didn't recognize there was a paradigm shift when you went to a pure fiat-based system. And you didn't really have any economic data to then extrapolate conclusions from because you always had some kind of goal-based system, right? So everyone's, I think, working under the assumption that this data that they're looking at for centuries is valid, but that was a very serious break in the way the system works.
Well, let me just say this. Yeah. Let me just say this. The country is in such a financially precarious position that people don't even understand. And you're making a very good point, right? Which is that what do we have to fall back on in the United States other than A, our military, and B, this, accepted axiom globally that the dollar is going to remain the reserve currency ad infinitum, which, just isn't true. It's just mathematically an impossibility. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's it, right? So what we have is we have a bloated government that is spending too much, that has fooled itself into thinking that it can offer people, social benefits and, all of these things that we talk about, canceling student debt and, subsidies and incentives and all this stuff. We fooled ourselves into thinking that we can just do that and that we really never have to pay this tab. It'll never come due.
Yeah, and again, I think, and let me turn that into a question because Chris has a point on this. I think that's an important, goes back to incentives, right? You got to always question what's the incentive of the, but obviously I'm doing something not that dissimilar, and that's somewhat to be expected. But I think you have to do it in a way where the degree of integrity. Chris, I know you want to wrap up that point you want to bring up, and then I'll bring up some of the other audience. But go ahead, Chris.
Well, let me just make a couple of points. The first is the gentleman is just speaking is 100% right. I mean, nobody that makes their way onto the financial media, nobody that's anybody, okay, is held accountable when they're wrong, and everybody is taken seriously regardless of what their track record is. And so the financial media will have, we'll have the same people on over and over and over, regardless. Mike Novogratz, I'm sure he's a nice guy, right? I'm sure he's done great as an investor, but like comes on CNBC 150,000 times, pumps up this Terra coin, the Luna coin. He goes out and gets a fucking tattoo of it, whatever. He's peddling an asset in an asset class that nobody knows anything about. Nobody knows where it's going to be in 20 years. It doesn't really seem to serve any purpose, provide any product or service, whatever. He gets as much airtime as he wants to come in, talk about that, whatever. This thing crashes. It goes to zero. Billions of dollars are wiped off. And who's the next guest? A week later, it's like, oh, let's have this guy on for his mea culpa, and then for his thoughts on his next idea. It's like, how about you fucking don't, right? Like, and I can't watch one more day of Tom Lee. I'm sure he's a nice guy. I don't know what incentivizes him. Maybe he really does think that the market is only going to go up and things are only going to be great all the time. But, they described him as like the keynote guest a month ago. Somebody said, like, our keynote guest on Halftime Report is Tom Lee. I'm like, I know what this fucking guy's going to say. I've been listening to him say it for 5 years, yet they continue to go to him. It's like, all right, the same people. Nobody saw March of 2020 coming. There was not one goddamn person on the financial news that said this virus is going to be a problem. It's going to shock the shit out of the markets. Everything's going to get closed down and we're going to have a huge, huge, huge issue. Not one person said that. What happened was the market crashed, and then afterwards they started bringing people on like, well, what do we do? Who could have seen this coming? What would you do here? So like the idea that nobody is held accountable and everybody's talking their book is 100% right. To go back to what I was just saying about the country is in a very precarious financial position. Okay. We don't have any productive capacity in the country. We're not producing anything anymore. So if you're an Austrian economist or, you're an old school economist, productivity is at the core of everything. You have to produce things in order to incite demand, in order to make money, in order to collect on the top line for your business or for your municipality or for the government, whatever. There has to be production happening somewhere, and we don't have any production. We rely on the production of other countries, namely countries like China, right? We get a lot of our shit from China. We get a lot of our stuff from Mexico, right? And so the lack of productive capacity means that we have to come up with money to get all this stuff over here. Where does that money come from? Well, it comes from really adding to the national debt and printing money, right? And that is an unsustainable path. We cannot continue to just print money and run deficits in order to import everything to sustain our quality of life forever. You can't. It's a mathematical impossibility. It's a logical fallacy. Doesn't make any sense. And so what we're sitting on, what we're banking on, the things that make this Inflation Reduction Act possible, that, we can go out and say, all right, $400 billion in new spending, or the mindset that can empower somebody like Elizabeth Warren to go out there and say, we need to cancel all student debt right now. This frame of mind that we're in all hinges upon the idea that the dollar is going to remain the reserve currency and the dollar is going to continue to be in demand, because if we lose the dollar, we lose everything. Our quality of life in the country will drop in a fashion that people are not going to be able to ignore. Even 9-10% inflation. Okay, it's a huge discomfort for a lot of people, but it's not famine, plague, pestilence, and austerity. If we lose the dollar, we will see real austerity in the country. So what's happening right now? Right now you have the BRIC nations, okay, all joint. So Russia goes in and invades Ukraine, right? The West comes out and says, we're going to sanction Russia. Right. So we're going to cut off, Russia from the SWIFT system. We're going to not deal in Russian assets, whatever, the euro and the EU rather, and the US, and everybody, bands together because, that's our plan. We're going to stick it to them. We're going to make a point. What does Russia do? Russia turns around and says, okay, well, we have the oil and we have a bunch of gold, and we've been de-dollarizing ourselves over the last decade along with China by, basically selling our dollar reserves that we have. And so Russia says, okay, bring it. Kick us off the SWIFT system. No problem. By the way, if you want our oil, if you want anything from our country, you're going to have to pay for it in rubles, or you're going to have to pay for it in gold, right? So the price of everything oil-related crashes in Russia. What happens? China swoops in and says, oh, here's a bunch of nice strategic oil assets that we're going to be able to use for the next 100 years. We'll buy some of these. By the way, you're our longtime ally, Russia. Let's be friends. China and Russia gang up. Okay, great. So, as my friend Andy Scheckman said on my podcast last week, what's one of the recent things that has given the dollar its reserve status is the idea that, it's going to be pegged to oil, right? That the U.S. protection of the Saudi kingdom is going to make, the dollar essentially a petrodollar, and that's that. And so what are we seeing now? Well, we're seeing Saudi Arabia ally itself with China and Russia. Oh, and now all of a sudden, India's in the picture too. So now you have really 4, 5, 6 major countries that have a lot of productive capacity, not just in oil, but, China produces everything. Remember when we couldn't get pharmaceuticals during COVID because we couldn't get some of the stuff we needed from China? I mean, everything comes from China. So now you have Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, India together. They come out in June and make an announcement that they're starting their own reserve currency, right? Nobody pays attention. Nobody notices. We're having what I think could be a historic bifurcation of the global economy right now, wherein the dollar is, legitimately in the midst of being challenged as the global reserve currency. And nobody notices. Nobody writes about it. Nobody talks about it. And you have Elizabeth Warren calling for the cancellation of student debt. So to say that people are understanding what's going on and reacting with a modicum of humility and modesty and common sense and fiscal conservativeness is just a falsehood. People just don't get it, and so the country is in this insanely precarious position that nobody seems to understand. The last point I want to make is that, look, we've seen 225 basis points of rate hikes in the last 5 months, leading up to December of 2018, when we saw the market crash, and then we saw, Steve Mnuchin flip out and call the banks, and with the Fed had to come out and kind of pivot. Then, okay, that was 2.5 or 3 years of 25 basis point hikes prior to that happening. That we saw that crash, right? What we've just done now is we've hiked 225 basis points in the span of 6 months, and if people don't think that there is going to be a major lockup in credit, even with all this extra liquidity, a major lockup in credit markets, that the aftershocks of these rate hikes have been felt yet. People that think that, these things have made their way through the system, I think are kidding themselves. I think that the market is due to be shocked here. I think that, and they're still raising, right? So they'll raise another 50 basis points or 75 basis points, whatever. But at some point over the next quarter or two, in my opinion, I feel like the market is really going to throw a shit fit. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make. Thank you.
So maybe my few understand this is not so sarcastic. After all, maybe if you really do understand it.
Well, look, if you were going to try to engineer do you agree that Russia and China have worked on de-dollarizing over the last decade? Yeah, but hasn't it accelerated over the last decade? Like the Russia holds like no dollar-denominated reserves anymore, do they? So you just think that the dollar is going to maintain its strength in the face of, the country's financial position, just because people trust it that it will remain the reserve currency going forward. The dollar's strength right now is coming from the fact that people believe that the Fed is doing the right thing and raising rates, and that they're going to be able to sustain that. That's where I think a lot of the strength in the dollar is coming from. And when the Fed is forced to pivot, and they will be forced to pivot, you're going to see those gains evaporate. Let's talk about the dollar ruble, though, right? Like, the ruble lost a ton of its value against the dollar when we put the sanctions in place, and now it's back and has eclipsed those highs. So what do you attribute that to? Right. So you don't think it has anything to do with Russia's productive capacity, or,
I don't.
Yeah, in essence, they're a giant oil company, right? But you don't think the fact that they control the productive means there gives them leverage that we don't have? What would the quality of life in the U.S. look like, if we couldn't import from China?
So can I say something real quick? I actually love this backward. This kind of goes back to the respectful conversation. I like, Chris, your Socratic method, which is asking questions to answer the question, which I think is actually good.
We are either going to suffer a loss of quality of living, or we're going to see the dollar depreciate. It's going to be one or the other. Yeah, and that's a very good point. There's I have a long only portfolio that I run. I'm not a long only investor, but one of my portfolios is specific just to long only. And, I've bought some tax-free municipal bonds and shit like that over the last 6 months, 8 months, just because I buy everything in there, because I don't want to sit around and have to bother thinking about, well, what's going to happen next, right? So I own some bonds, I own some stocks, I own a lot of miners. I try to not stay, dollar denominated. I try to move out of the dollar also. That's a fair enough statement, and that's something you're not ever going to hear me tell you that anybody knows exactly where it's going to go. I just think it's important to get as many perspectives on the table as possible if we're going to try to make some kind of educated decisions for ourselves, for our family, for our community, for the country, for our municipality, for our state. We can't be like, we have to welcome perspectives that don't, like that last guy was a currency trader. He knows a shitload more about currency than I do. He knows, about how Gazprom, funds their accounts and how they process their payments. And, I don't understand that stuff. I'm like a very bird's eye kind of like, to me, the big point there was, if they have all the productive capacity and our quality of life would suffer greatly without them, well, then we're beholden to them. And that's all you need to know. It doesn't matter what the DXY is at right now. It just matters that we're beholden to them. To your point about student loans, right? People say this stuff all the time. They're like, well, it's the government's debt, and then the government just writes it down. And so, like you're saying, I didn't even understand half the shit you're just saying. There's a contraction in the money supply, this, that, the other. It's like, look, nothing's free. That's all you need to know. Nothing's free. You got $3 trillion worth of college and college-related expenses that have occurred through the creation of some type of debt somewhere, right? Somebody had to pay all of that money for kids to go through college, right? Somebody paid the professors, somebody paid the universities, somebody paid for the books. All those things cost money. The reason a university works is because it incentivizes its employees by paying them, right? And so they're providing a service to universities. Somebody pays for that service, right? And now what you're saying is, whoever paid for it, whether it came out of Joe Biden's back pocket or it came out of some line item on an Excel spreadsheet somewhere, that somebody can just make that go away. And that just doesn't make sense. That means that the taxpayer is on the hook for it one way or the other, whether it's from, higher taxes, whether it's from, we're going to bear the brunt of the cost through inflation. You cannot, as much as our current administration hates to hear it, you can't just manifest free stuff out of thin air, because at the end of the day, products and services have to come from somewhere. And what incentivizes people to provide services or create products is, you're going to pay them. So, it's all very basic to me. Well, the only reason that, our poverty line is much higher than theirs is because we've been relying on their productive capacity. I mean, the quality of life in the country, something we'll have to give, right? First off, our debt to GDP is a lot higher than China's is, right? Which just shows you that the amount of debt that we're taking on versus what it is that we're. So that means, like, if it comes down to brass tacks, like, we don't really have what we would need to produce in the country to maintain the quality of life that we have now. If something happened where, China cut us off, like the last guy said, well, things would get bad in very short order. And so, while we may not see it monetarily, we'll bear the brunt of it in our quality of life. I don't know. That's really the point there.
So I think that's maybe a good way to end. I just tweeted out it's ravens and tears is all I see on my Twitter app here. Everybody, again, please make sure you follow Chris. Make sure you follow Deer Point as well, who I did a space with not too long ago. Thank everybody for joining, participating, asking questions. I think this was a very interesting, thoughtful conversation. And again, please make sure you follow Chris. Check out the Quote the Raven podcast and enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Chris, you're the man. I do appreciate your time here.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers.